Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. Happy 2025 to all our listeners. I do hope the various holidays treated everyone well. We're back this week and in this new year with Tal Shalev, chief political correspondent for Walla News and a longtime friend of this podcast and Israel Policy Forum in general. We'll be taking a deep dive into the state of play of Israeli politics, including Benjamin Netanyahu's political fortunes at the dawn of yet another year in power, the state of his coalition government, Itamar Ben Gvir's waning power in this coalition government, ultra-Orthodox conscription, Donald Trump's potential impact, and this and much more on this episode. This was a very timely conversation and an important one about what's actually happening in Israel these days, beyond the headlines and beyond the front lines. Let's get to Tal Shalev. Hi, Tal. Happy New Year and welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Happy New Year. Happy to be here.
We're happy that you are here, Tal. And I had to go back and check. Last time you were on was a year ago exactly, early January 2024, which is really hard to believe. We were talking offline. Not much has changed. We're kidding, obviously. But first off, how are you doing? Now, 15 months or so into this war, and by the way, 2 years into this current Netanyahu government.
Well, personally, I'm fine. Thank you. I mean, this past year and 3 months, so many Israelis have been struck by tragedy or by grief or by loss or by wound. And I am fortunate enough to appreciate that I have been safe and sound, and so have my loved ones. I feel grateful for that. So personally, I'm fine. Nationally, as we say, I think things have only gotten worse in many ways. I think, first of all, that it's true that Israel has enjoyed and has succeeded in the past few months to gain some very significant strategic and geostrategic achievements. But internally, and that's what I cover, internally we're pretty much back to October the 6th and even worse, which of course means that my professional life is filled with a lot of noise coming from this government and a lot of hatred and a lot of internal divisions inside Israeli society. And, it's quite striking thinking we already know where these internal frictions lead Israel, and we're back to the same point again. So that's very frustrating.
That's very well said. And by the way, this is the reason why I wanted you on today, this week, and in this new year to talk about really the internal and domestic situation. And it's true, there's this dichotomy between the real achievements on the battlefield against Israel's enemies, while, like you said, internally, the situation has reverted back to pre-October 7th, which was really bad, as we all remember, and in some respects even worse, because it's still wartime. So let's start here, Tal, big picture. With the one and only Bibi Netanyahu, we have to start here. A year ago, when we spoke, it wasn't a given at all that Netanyahu would still be prime minister on New Year's Day 2025. And yet here we are. Bibi is still prime minister. He's still in power. And his coalition has actually grown with the addition of Gideon Sa'ar and a small right-wing faction which defected from the opposition to the coalition in late September. Sa'ar is now the foreign minister. Bibi also successfully fired Yoav Gallant as defense minister, and Gallant recently resigned completely, even from the Knesset, so he's no longer even in parliament. So another problem solved there for Netanyahu. And in general, I think the sense is that Bibi is more solid, more powerful than at any point since October 7th. So the question to you, is that a fair assessment, or am I overstating things just a bit?
No, I think for whatever counts, and that is there any threat on Netanyahu's coalition, then you're definitely right. Netanyahu, if he wants to, he can probably conclude his term in October 2026. And if he wants to, he can probably still be prime minister on New Year's Eve 2025. And definitely he, in the past year, has discovered his ninth life or something like that.
Or his 10th life,
His 10th life,
years.
I don't know. I don't know how much, it's hard to count, but whoever thought, and I think in January 2024, people still thought that, after such a disaster as big as October 7th, Netanyahu will have to resign, or at least the government will have to resign, and there will be new elections. Well, Netanyahu outplayed that prediction, as he outplayed many predictions all around his career, especially in the past 15 years or so. He did this, because he is a mastermind in public opinion and in media and in messaging. But he also did this because he has a very weak opposition fighting against him. If we go back to January 2024, the Netanyahu still had by his side Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot.
Mm-hmm.
They stayed there in his government way long after everyone understood that he's treating them like shit. Excuse me for my French.
Okay, not a problem.
Here we are, and they only left in June.
Right.
And basically Netanyahu used the legitimacy he got from Gantz and Eisenkot to get over the worst, time in his career, the first few weeks after the 7th of October, and then very much successfully has succeeded to manipulate public opinion, to ditch and to dodge taking responsibility. We are a year and 3 months after October 7th. No national inquiry committee has been established to check exactly what happened and in order to have a very thorough investigation on what happened. And again, he has a very weak opposition. Gantz and Eisenkot left the government in June, but then in September, the opposition lost Gideon Sa'ar, who basically crawled back to the Likud. And Sa'ar's joining the coalition is very significant because Netanyahu is no longer dependent on any one party. Having a 4 of 68 seats means that the only party that can actually threaten Netanyahu is Shas. And only if Shas leaves, Netanyahu loses his majority, and there's no prediction at the moment for Shas to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Netanyahu was also very, very lucky with a series of outstanding achievements by the Israeli security forces and the IDF, starting from the assassination of Nasrallah, continuing with the murdering of Ismail Haniyeh, continuing with the very successful Lebanon operation, and of course at the end, the collapse of the Assad regime. Netanyahu wasn't necessarily, responsible for these achievements, but he's definitely the political benefactor of these achievements, and this has succeeded to, bring him back some of the, I would say, good karma. And we should conclude with Donald Trump being elected to the White House in November. Some of my friends joke and say Netanyahu is so lucky. Sometimes it feels like God himself is a Netanyahu supporter because he basically keeps on giving him all of these gifts for him to recuperate. So I think you're definitely right diagnosing that Netanyahu is in a good situation. That being said, he still has, I think, his most significant political hurdle ahead, and that is the issue of the Haredi draft crisis. So there's no immediate threat for Netanyahu's rule, and I still think the only one who will decide if there will be early elections is Netanyahu. And I also don't think that Netanyahu will necessarily win in these elections, but for the time being, Netanyahu is doing very, very well. And I didn't even mention the fact that in December, his testimony started in the court in Tel Aviv. Now, that was supposed to be some big issue. There was this buildup for this. For years, we've been building up, waiting for this testimony. And Netanyahu, quite successfully, at least publicly and public opinion-wise, has succeeded to manipulate this event as well and to turn it into some kind of media circus instead of a real grave situation in which the Israeli prime minister is testifying in court. By the way, he's not really testifying right now because he's recuperating from his operation, but he is in the midst of his testimony.
Yeah, so he's just had a prostate removal surgery last week. So the judges have canceled the coming 2 weeks of testimony. And yes, it was a big deal on the first day that he took the stand. And then it just kind of became normalized, on the days that he deigned to actually testify. And the judges didn't release him because he is, after all, still the prime minister and still conducting a war. Just 2 points of information. Shas is obviously the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party that's a major part of Netanyahu's coalition. And October 2026, that's a major date, as it were. That's when elections by law have to be held, but that's nearly 2 years away. So no one truly believed that it would reach October 2026, especially after October 7th, 2023. Tal, I have to ask you, and this is more maybe for my benefit than the listeners' benefit, but I'm very curious to get your take. Gideon Sa'ar and his decision, like you said, crawling back to his original home, the Likud party, after he vowed for years and even in recent months that he would never, ever go back to Netanyahu. Maybe one of the most shameful episodes in Israeli political history, but you're a political reporter, and I assume you have fairly thick skin as far as these things go. But what was your reaction when you heard that Sa'ar was considering doing this and then actually did it? How did you take the news?
Well, first of all, he's not the first one to break a promise in Israeli politics.
Obviously not.
Just on this, every time it's from a different side. So if we just go, 4 years or 3.5 years back to 2021, when Naftali Bennett vowed in the election campaign that he will not form a government with Yair Lapid or with the Arab parties, and then went on to become a prime minister with the Arab parties and Yair Lapid. So Israeli politicians are not good in abiding by their promises. That's the ground promise. B, I think that Sa'ar, of course, not only talking about him, I don't want to talk only about him. I think you're right. It's shameful, especially I just don't really understand how he exactly lives with himself, given that Sa'ar lives in North Tel Aviv. All of his friends are from the liberal camp. He considers himself a liberal. He was one of the staunch vocal voices fighting against the judicial overhaul. He knows that this is a bad government that is doing bad in almost every parameter. If it's security or it's economy, if it's, the internal division, if it's the hatred, if it's the conspiracy theories, if it's the battle against the professional echelon in almost every public service, if it's the army or the economy ministry or the finance ministry or the judges, it's just inconceivable. That Sa'ar willingly decided to join this government and to, strengthen it. That being said, I think it's a colossal defeat of the opposition. And I think that the fact that Sa'ar joined the coalition is mainly on the opposition, on many members of the opposition. First of all, on Benny Gantz. Yeah. Benny Gantz and Gideon Sa'ar ran together in the last elections. They had 12 seats and Gideon Sa'ar took 4 seats away. Now, this is not the first time Benny Gantz fights with one of his partners. He has a history of not getting along with people he runs with in the elections. It starts with Yair Lapid, Bogi Ya'alon, Gabi Ashkenazi, and Gideon Sa'ar. And the rift between Gantz and Sa'ar was out in the open from the day after the elections, and nobody did anything to close it or to reconcile. B, it's on Yair Lapid as the leader of the opposition. C, it's on Avigdor Lieberman, who was in the midst of negotiations with Sa'ar about them joining forces for the next election. Now, it's on all of them because the news about or the rumors about Sal leaving the opposition and joining the government were out in the open for months. And none of them really made an effort to try and keep Sal on their side. And once again, they let their personal rifts, overcome the general good. And the general good is not to let this government continue, or at least not strengthen it. Now, if we look at the current crises that Netanyahu is dealing with, if Gideon Sa'ar wasn't there, he would be in a much more difficult situation. And Gideon Sa'ar gave Netanyahu air. So the opposition, by its misdoing, just gave Netanyahu a present. So I think that's the big picture with Gideon Sa'ar. It's about them and not so much about him.
Very interesting, and I think a fair assessment. I have to get into the coalition politics that you alluded to. Obviously, Sa'ar is now part of the coalition, and like you said, has given Netanyahu more breathing room, more air. But there are some possible rifts, tensions inside the coalition. Maybe not enough to topple the government, obviously, but significant nonetheless. I wanted to start with Itamar Ben Gvir, the national security minister and head of the far-right Jewish Power Party. Tal, what's happening between him and Bibi? Last week, Ben Gvir flexed his muscles. He refused to vote with the coalition on an important budget bill. He forced Bibi to leave his hospital bed and to run to the Knesset to vote. Ben Gvir later apologized, but it's fair to say the coalition discipline has frayed on his end, including earlier today. Is this just Ben Gvir playing kind of the bad boy of the coalition, or is there something more to it? Is there a deeper rift emerging there?
Well, Ben Gvir is doing what Ben Gvir does, and that is seeking attention. Mm-hmm. He is addicted to attention. He's addicted to having his name in the headlines. And it's actually been going on for over a month. He's been basically banning the coalition votes in the Knesset. First, it was about his demand to fire the attorney general. He was pushing to fire the attorney general. And then it became about budgets for the police. But at large, it's just Ben Gvir being Ben Gvir. I tell my sources in the coalition, oh, it's such a shock. You put someone who likes to do provocations in your coalition, and he's actually doing these provocations inside your coalition. So I think that Ben Gvir is just doing what he's doing because he can. Mm-hmm. So I think that is the main thing. He is starting to annoy Netanyahu very much, but Netanyahu is kind of ignoring him. And he can, because he has Gideon Sa'ar, because he doesn't necessarily need Ben Gvir for a majority in the Knesset. So this is a rift that is, I think it's more about public images. It's more about public image and public perception, and Ben Gvir, just addicted to headlines and being in the spotlight. I don't think there's a real threat at the moment. Netanyahu is not going to fire Ben Gvir, and Ben Gvir is not likely to resign, at least as long as there's no elections in the horizon. There could be a scenario in which Ben Gvir does smell elections, and then he will resign just a minute before the election in order to be in the opposition during the election so he can attack Netanyahu and campaign
Netanyahu,
the right.
Netanyahu from the right, yeah.
Yeah. But it's more about Ben Gvir being Ben Gvir and Netanyahu ignoring him. That being said, it's a dangerous spiral, because what is happening is that when other partners in the coalition, and specifically the Haredi parties, when they see Ben Gvir doing whatever he wants to and Netanyahu not doing anything, then the rabbis are saying, wait. If Ben Gvir can ban votes and play games with the coalition in order to get budgets for the police, then why are you MKs not doing the same about the Haredi draft bill, which Netanyahu promised you 2 years ago? And that is kind of a slippery slope when you have one player who's not playing by the rules and you're not punishing him, then all of the players start not playing by the rules, and that becomes complicated. And that is basically the situation in which Netanyahu is right now, where he has Ben Gvir on the one hand and Agudat Israel, the Ashkenazi Haredi party, on the other hand, and both of them are not necessarily abiding with the coalition on its votes, and the coalition is experiencing many difficulties and delays in its deadlines, especially the budget deadlines, because of this.
Very interesting. And I have to say, well, by the way, Tal, who doesn't want to see his name at the top of the headlines? Speaking as two journalists, but on a more serious note,
I really, really, really beg to differ from that comparison, Neri. We want our headline. We want our name in the headlines on big scoops and exposés. Ben Gvir just wants his name to be in the headline. It doesn't matter what it says.
Doesn't matter. Yes, yeah. Thank you for that point of very.
I don't want the headline of the podcast to be like why Tal and Neri are just like Ben Gvir.
Right. Although in terms of Twitter
traffic, it might work.
Traffic, yeah, it might work, right? Or the aggregators. You say, Tal Shalev and Neri Zilber.
The new Ben Gvir.
Yeah, I said they were just like Itamar Ben Gvir, God forbid. But we have to say, on a more serious note, in terms of Itamar Ben Gvir and also his fellow traveler on the far right, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, if there was possibly, hopefully, a hostage and ceasefire deal in Gaza that halted the war, at least for a little while, would that maybe change Ben Gvir and Smotrich's calculus? Because they've threatened now for the better part of a year that they would topple the government if Bibi went for what they called repeatedly a reckless deal. A reckless deal, obviously, that purposes to get Israelis out of Hamas captivity. Do you take them seriously? Do you take them at their word when they keep issuing these threats to Netanyahu?
I don't think they're exactly on the same line on this. I think that Ben Gvir is more serious with his threats. Smotrich, I know, has basically clarified his red lines, quote unquote, to Netanyahu. And I think that basically Netanyahu is working within Smotrich's red lines to begin with. That's why we're not discussing a full deal to bring back all of the hostages, but we keep on discussing only a partial deal, in which Netanyahu doesn't need to declare the end of the war. And I think that is kind of the framework. Netanyahu is operating within the framework that Smotrich enables him to operate within. Smotrich also has no incentive of leaving the government. He is expected to basically be wiped out in the next election, let alone come back to be finance minister. And he is probably one of the most effective ministers from his point of view, or at least from his settlers electorate point of view, budget-wise, et cetera, and also, in his presence in the defense ministry as a minister in the defense ministry. So I don't think that Smotrich will threaten or actually leave the government so quickly. Ben Gvir, that depends on his political calculus. Again, if he feels that Netanyahu is going to cut for early elections soon, whether with a Saudi peace deal or any other excuse, then he might see a hostage deal as an opportunity to leave the government on the right-wing sentiment, which will be against the deal. Of course, because it includes the release of heavy prisoners, and he will play on that. But if he doesn't believe that the elections are close, he might, just protest very loudly, just like he did in the Lebanon deal, and not necessarily accomplish his threats.
I see. So there is actual wiggle room for Netanyahu to get a deal, whereas
a partial deal. That's
partial. Yeah.
I think that to begin with, Netanyahu is wiggling in the framework which won't rattle his coalition. That's why I think personally that a year and 3 months after the 7th of October, we can end the war and bring back all of the hostages. But Netanyahu isn't even going there, and he's not even discussing that. He hasn't discussed that in the past year at all. It's always been about a partial deal, because a partial deal enables Netanyahu to go with his coalition and release some amount of hostages, but not declare the end of war, which for both Ben Gvir and Smotrich would be a red line.
But even last summer, there was a partial deal or a multi-stage deal on the table, and
it's exactly the same deal.
Yeah, it's exactly the same deal, and Netanyahu walked away from that, no matter what Biden administration officials want to say.
He's been walking away. He walked away in February. He walked away in May. He walked away in July. And you know what? He might be walking away as we speak.
Mm-hmm.
But again, to begin with, the only thing he's talking about is a deal that his coalition can contain.
Swallow.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. That's actually more positive news. Maybe a less positive news for the overall country, but positive maybe for the Netanyahu coalition. We'll be right back after this brief message.
During this period of upheaval in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, Israeli politics, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional affairs, Israel Policy Forum experts are shedding light on complex policy issues and breaking news developments impacting Israel's future as secure, Jewish, and democratic. Be sure to visit our website, subscribe to our emails, and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky for timely explainers and analysis on key policy issues. Links to these platforms can be found in the show notes of this podcast. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible, nuanced analysis, please make a gift today so that our work can continue to have an impact. Donate now at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
The big issue that you mentioned earlier, ultra-Orthodox conscription into the army, the Haredi draft bill. It's a big issue currently on the agenda. The government, I think it's fair to say, is tying itself in knots, trying to find some formula that appeases the Supreme Court, the IDF, and the vast majority of the Israeli public, on the one hand, who all want to see kind of a real, genuine military conscription by the Haredim. And on the other hand, you have the ultra-Orthodox political parties and the rabbis who decidedly do not want to see that happen. So where does this issue stand at the moment, Tal? Is there some kind of compromise that's possible? Will Bibi just play for time on this issue like he always has and nothing will change? Or could this actually really shake the coalition?
I think option number two, Netanyahu will play on time. It's probably the most predictable and the most probable answer. I don't think there will be a conscription bill. I think that there is no middle line between what the army needs and what the Haredis are willing to give. I think that Israel Katz, the current defense minister, is trying to, sell himself and a campaign as if he's going to bring history. But from what I understand, for people involved in the talks, they're not even speaking the same language. And even if the Haredis would be willing to make compromises, which they are not, their compromises will not be enough in order, not for the Supreme Court, but especially not for the Israeli public, meaning also not for Yuli Edelstein, the chair of the Defense Committee in the Knesset, who is a significant actor here. He basically heads a group of 4 or 5 relatively liberal, or at least on this issue, liberal Likud MKs. I don't think that there's any way that there will be a solution, a compromise that can answer all sides' demands. So, and we're hearing more and more people inside the coalition, especially, even from the Haredi parties themselves, that just say, okay, so we'll continue without a bill. We'll just let time go on and we'll live the way we are living now. To remind you, there hasn't, basically, all of the Haredi youngsters, 18 plus, have been supposed to be drafted by the law since last June, because that's when the last conscription bill expired. And only about 3,000, subpoenas were sent out. And if I'm not mistaken, less than 100 arrived. So those 3,000 people might get sanctioned and they might not be able to leave the country or get a driver's license. But that's a price that the Haredi parties will be willing to pay. The problem is, of course, that their army needs soldiers. The current figure that the army says they need 12,000 soldiers. 7,000 of them are warriors. And if you do not have any bill that starts to bring in the Haredim to the army, the people who will have to bear that burden are the reserve soldiers who have already served, many of them almost a year in the army in the past year. And just the problem will just continue to sizzle inside Israeli society with no solution.
And, well, by the way, how the Haredim have been living for over 70 years since the creation of the state. So this would be a major shift and a major earthquake in Israeli society, and obviously for the IDF. But if there is no real resolution and the Haredim don't actually enlist like they may be supposed to, how does that square with what the Supreme Court has mandated the government to actually do, which is not only conscript Haredim, but also, like you said, issue real sanctions, personal sanctions against the quote-unquote draft dodgers, but also sanctions possibly against the ultra-Orthodox community as a whole, right?
Yeah,
it's a legal issue.
Again, okay, so there are two different issues. The sanctions against the communities as a whole are some of the allowances and stipends that the government gives the ultra-Orthodox parties and, education yeshivas based on the conscription bill. That has been cut since there's no conscription bill.
The allowances have been cut. That's a major
issue. But some of that money can be compensated from donations abroad, from the big communities, especially in the US. And some of the money can be, the Haredi parties have huge amounts of coalition money inside the next budget. So some of the money you can, give to them in other channels. And about the personal sanctions and about, the army not actually drafting all of the Haredi youngsters like the Supreme Court told them. Okay, so we will continue to have these debates in the Supreme Court. At the end of the day, the Supreme Court cannot, make the army, cannot enforce. There's no way to enforce the army actually sending the subpoenas, and B, not only sending the subpoenas, but enforcing the subpoenas.
Right.
So it'll just be this, we say Isra bluff.
Yeah, like a Israeli bluff.
Yeah, it's Israeli bluff. Both, even if there's a conscription bill or without a conscription bill, there's still a bluff, okay? It's still a bluff. It just, with a bill, the bluff will be regulated. And without a bill, the bluff will just continue. But it's still a bluff. And as long as there's no real change in the ultra-Orthodox leadership, talking about enlisting and educating to enlisting, then there will not be any real change. That's the big, I think, one of the big, abyss after the 7th of October is that Israelis or secular Israelis and national religious Israelis, what I call the serving sector, the industrial sector, those that have been serving in the army, that is the great disappointment, is that all of us have been putting our hands inside and trying to take part in the war. And why hasn't there been any similar change in the ultra-Orthodox leadership? It's very disappointing. It's heartbreaking, but it is what it is.
It is heartbreaking. Israel is probably the most likely outcome. But we should mention, it's not just kind of secular Israelis, right, that feel very strong in this issue. It's also
the
voters,
national religious,
exactly. Voters and active supporters of this coalition government.
True, that's one of the reasons I mentioned earlier that Smotrich has nothing to wait for in elections. Smotrich basically has lost most of his electoral base on this issue because you have, the national religious community is today very significant and very dominant in the IDF, both in the regular service and both in the reservist service. You have families and big families, women, by the way, it's amazing because the people the women, the wives have been motivating the protest against the government. It's a national religious feminist or feminine movement against the conscription bill. And Smotrich is perceived as someone who is cooperating with the Haredim instead of trying to help his own electorate and ease the burden on his own electorate. So it's true that it's a very interesting divide. Usually you have a right-left divide or a yes or no Bibi divide. Here you have a divide between those who serve in the army, about 60 to 70% of Israelis, and the 30 to 40% of Israelis, both Arabs and ultra-Orthodox, that do not serve in the army. It's very interesting.
Very interesting. Very good point. And this is why it's such a delicate and complicated issue for this coalition and this prime minister to navigate. But navigate it, I am sure he will try, as always. Tal, the next issue on this government's agenda, somehow, like you said at the top, the judicial overhaul is back in our lives. We mentioned it last month on this podcast, but the efforts of this government that they pursued to terrible effect, I should say, before October 7th, is ostensibly back. This is what Justice Minister Yariv Levin has said. There is almost daily speculation about the job security of the Attorney General, Gali Bar-Miara. There's also daily speculation about Yariv Levin possibly going after Supreme Court judges and the way they're appointed. There are coalition ministers, but also just regular parliamentarians, Knesset members, who openly refuse to cooperate with the legal authorities or with court orders. I mean, I hate to bring this up again because it brings us back to, like you said, October 6th, 2023. But how seriously do you take the rhetoric and the threats that we hear from this government with regard to reactivating the judicial overhaul and, again, going after the legal and judicial institutions of the state?
So I actually don't think the judicial overhaul is back. I think it never left.
Okay.
Yariv Levin has been refusing to appoint Yitzhak Amit as the Chief Supreme Court Justice since October 7th, and that hasn't changed. It's just that the focus on it has, for many months it wasn't in the headlines, but Yariv Levin was refusing to appoint Amit since October 7th. The only thing that has changed is that now he's declaring that the judicial overhaul is back, but actually it never left. Now, Yariv Levin has a deadline, basically, a Supreme Court deadline. He needs to appoint a president through the Supreme Court by the 16th of January. And so far, he has been ignoring and trying to dodge and ditch that deadline. I will carefully predict that Yitzhak Amit will eventually be voted sometime in the next few days, but Yariv Levin won't be there in the room to do it. Now, that being said, we have other initiatives. As you said, there's a huge populist movement inside the government. But by the way, not activated and motivated by Yariv Levin, but actually activated and motivated by Ben Gvir and Shlomo Kari, who is the communications minister and considered very close to Yair Netanyahu, Netanyahu's son. They are the one who are pushing to fire the attorney general. They've been pushing to do that in the first few months. By the way, there is a process in which the government can replace the attorney general. They need to summon the committee that appointed her and present the case and explain, or at least try to prove that they cannot work with the attorney general because there are significant differences between their approaches. And the government has already prepared, that file. But Netanyahu has been reluctant to fire the attorney general. He knows that would be very dangerous to his conflict of interest agreement that he signed. And
because of his corruption case.
Exactly. Because of his corruption case, he committed not to make any decisions regarding the judicial system. And if his government fires the attorney general, then one could appeal to the Supreme Court and say that is a violation of his conflict of interest. Meanwhile, there's Shlomo Kari, the communication minister. He is in the midst of some kind of constitutional crisis with the Supreme Court. there's a verdict by the Supreme. I won't get into details because it's very technical, but Shlomo Kari has been refusing to appoint members to one of the committees that oversights the Public Broadcast Association. The Supreme Court ordered him to appoint or to actually not to extend the membership of two existing members of this committee. And Shlomo Kari, on the record, says, I do not intend to abide to the Supreme Court ruling. So there's already a constitutional crisis there. And Kari, by the way, is promoting his own revolution or overhaul, the media overhaul. And he is in the midst of promoting some very aggressive bills against free media in Israel, bills that are intended at intimidating the public authority, the public broadcast authority, and strengthening Channel 14, the Israeli version of Fox News. And you have many other private MKs in the Likud pushing outrageous bills, populist bills. So, it's not that judicial overhaul is back. It's just that this government's tendency to poke and try to destroy everything or the pillars of Israeli democracy, that has returned in full power. After October 7th, everyone was talking, we have to fight together, we have to win together. But by now, the government is back as just, pointing fingers in the eyes of whoever didn't vote for them. If it's on the Supreme Court, it's about the media. It's about bereaved families and the refusal to establish a national inquiry committee that has also been turned into some kind of political issue. This government or members of Netanyahu's party are still waging a war against the IDF and the army. So basically, this is a very, very violent government and forceful government. After October 7th, it seemed like maybe they laid their arms, but I think a year later, after the last time we talked, it's clear that they are definitely back in an all-out war, internal war.
Yeah, they definitely are. There was a level of, say, contrition, humility, maybe even soul-searching in the wake of October 7th. You even heard that from some members of the current government bearing some responsibility for the 9 months previous to October 7th and when they tore this country apart because of the judicial overhaul. And all of that seems to be gone, like it never existed. And like you said, they're going after not just the courts, not just the attorney general, but also various independent media outlets and state media outlets. They're going after the security chiefs, whether in the IDF or the Shin Bet. And this is daily. And you really have to kind of cover Israel like you cover Israel, Tal, to fully appreciate, the madness of all this going on as Israel is still fighting a war. That's what I think is sometimes lost by people who aren't here and don't follow the Hebrew language media. Because it's just difficult to follow everything. It's
crazy. It's like they're swamping us. I think I opened and said that a very noisy government. It's very difficult. I admit, even reporting and analyzing, it's very difficult, to understand what's important and what's not, and what is just cacophonic noise, and what is real and what is not. But you know what, Neri? I think the most heartbreaking thing about it is that it's very scary. I don't know if I shared this that I feel since October 7th, many times I feel like we're living in a biblical story, and that this disaster that happened to us is like this, it's a biblical disaster in its magnitude, and the hatred and the evil that was discovered on October 7th are of biblical magnitude. And then I think if we think I'm not religious, but if I think in, a biblical story mode, then I think that this is a punishment from God for Israel that was embroiled in its internal fighting and then you think, okay, then you would expect Israel to learn a lesson after October 7th. But here we are again in the same internal war, which makes me very, very frightened that there would be another disaster on the way.
Yes. No, I share that sentiment, Tal, and I'm also not a particularly religious person. And I look at it also, or even maybe more from a political point of view. There are 68 kind of quote unquote members of this government, and you never hear a peep of dissent about all of this happening now during wartime from any of them. So they're all essentially, like, sorry to say, Gidon Sar, putting their own personal political interests ahead of the interest of the country that they I guess love. I suppose they love the country, and I suppose they love the society, but it sometimes doesn't seem that way. And again, you can agree or disagree on policy and whatnot, but you would think that after the last 15 months, their priorities would have shifted.
I mean, there are people let's think about a tank right now serving inside Gaza. And this tank probably, or most likely, has someone who voted for the coalition and someone who didn't vote for a coalition. And now, after the government is igniting these wars again. Now they're going to fight while they're inside the same tank about whether Yitzhak Amit should be or not be the Supreme Court, or is the Supreme Court responsible for the 7th of October? And it's just so unnecessary right now. And you said there is no humbleness. It's very, it's sad. It's very sad.
And even like, let alone the Supreme Court and Yitzhak Amit and all of that, but you have the defense minister, the new defense minister, openly attacking the IDF chief of staff and the IDF spokesman, even today, as we both know. And so if you're in that tank, you're looking, maybe you're not following the news, but you come out of Gaza or Lebanon or the West Bank and you're like, well, what the hell is happening here? So my defense minister is attacking my overall commander, and over what? Over politics, truly. Tal, final question to you, and it's a big one. Mm-hmm. And it's one that I'm sure all of our listeners are very interested in. In just a few days, January 20th, a new / old U.S. president will be taking office, Donald Trump. This is, fair to say, will be a moment of joy and celebration at the very top of this Israeli government. I think that's, an open secret. And I think it's also fair to say that especially this Israeli government, and really maybe many / most Israelis, think that this new Trump administration will greenlight everything and anything Israel wants to do on a whole host of issues, whether the Gaza war, whether West Bank settlements, whether a Saudi peace deal. So essentially just kind of laying out a red carpet for Israeli policies and Israeli interests. As both a political and diplomatic correspondent, what do you think about this sentiment, both in the Israeli government and amongst the Israeli people, vis-a-vis the looming Donald Trump presidency?
Well, first of all, I have an anecdotal story that when Donald Trump was first elected in 2016, I wrote this piece about how he is the dream president of Israel, and I made a list of all the dreams that Israelis had that he would give them, and I was kind of skeptical. I was like, well, they can dream, but most of these things will not happen. And then President Trump, in his 4 years, actually did fulfill many of these dreams. So I am very careful, but I think, let them dream, and then maybe these dreams will break down in reality. I won't ruin mostly, I think, right-wing dreams, especially you hear dreams from Bezalel Smotrich and the Settler Council, the Yesha Council, Judea and Samaria Council, and the settlers. They have the biggest dreams. Of course, Netanyahu has its own dreams. They're not necessarily the same dreams as Bezalel Smotrich and the settlers' dreams.
Attacking Iran, for one.
Exactly. Netanyahu's dream is A, attacking Iran, and B, bringing Saudi Arabia, even if that might entail a price, or at least a rhetorical price, committing to a future Palestinian entity or something, while Ben Gvir and Smotrich are dreaming of annexing the West Bank and annexing maybe the Gaza Strip and even building settlements inside Lebanon. And those dreams, I think, are doomed to fail. First of all, my personal dream is that President Trump's presidency will start with a hostage deal, and my personal dream is that he will be able to bring the hostages home, not only in a partial deal, but eventually all of the hostages. That is my personal dream. And I think majority of Israelis by now, 60 to 70% will support any deal to bring back the hostages.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's much about perception, and it's not necessarily that Donald Trump will make all these dreams come true. But the fact that Israelis think, or Netanyahu is presenting him as someone who might make these dreams come true, that is exactly the difference from President Biden, who, even though he was the most pro-Israel president ever, he will always suffer from a deficit in Israeli public because of Netanyahu's campaign against the Democrats, and because Netanyahu is basically, a declared Republican out in the open. I predict that not all of the settlers' dreams will come true. I think that President Trump has his own agenda. And then, you know what? If President Trump will bring peace to the Middle East, then I'll be happy. He did bring peace the last time he was president. And even though it kind of confuses the sides here in Israel, I think a majority of Israelis would like President Trump to bring another breakthrough to the Middle East. And Netanyahu also could use a Saudi Arabia normalization deal in order to run to an early election and use that and campaign on that achievement, and, perhaps bring back some of the votes that some of the supporters he has lost in the past 2 years.
That's not a outlandish scenario, but I have to press you a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we all hope that Donald Trump does great things in our part of the world, and hopefully other parts of the world, but remains to be seen. But how hard do you think Trump will press this Israeli government to achieve these various things, like, say, a hostage deal that Israel will have to presumably give up certain things to achieve, or, like you said, a Saudi deal, which, even rhetorical lip service towards the Palestinian entity/state will cause massive damage to this coalition.
Again, if Netanyahu decides to go for a Saudi Arabia deal, that means that he has decided to go to elections. That means he's given up on his coalition, because this coalition will not survive a Saudi normalization deal. That is A. B, I think that if anyone can pressure Netanyahu to do something, it's President Trump. Because while President Biden was there, and Netanyahu always has a tendency to fight with Democrat presidents, he can't fight with President Trump. He can't publicly fight with him. So I think that President Trump's pressure on Netanyahu will be much more effective. I don't know how much he will have to push, but it will be more effective, because Netanyahu's, tendency is always to use the American pressure, if it's Democrat pressure, for a political rift. But when it comes from the Republicans, he can't do that. So that's why I think it'll be more effective, or at least I hope it'll be more effective.
And that's a fantastic point, that after Netanyahu hoped and dreamed of a Trump victory, and, like you said, sold it to the Israeli public as, the solution to all of Israel's problems, and, like you said, tarnished Joe Biden and the Biden administration as working at cross purposes with Israel, which I don't agree with, for the record. I think the Biden administration was hugely supportive of Israel, but you talk to many Israelis, and they'll kind of parrot the line that Netanyahu and his mouthpieces put forward for the better part of the past year. Bibi can't afford to be seen to break with President Trump, right? It won't work domestically in Israel. Picking yet another fight with an American president, especially
if you want
Donald
to sell
Trump.
yourself as Mr. America, then you can't have a fight with both sides of the aisle, right?
Right. And
interesting enough, I do think that President Trump is wiser than in his first tenure, or at least I hope he's wiser than his first tenure. And we should also remember that Miriam Edelson, who is a significant player, she's not on Netanyahu's side anymore. So I'm not sure how much President Trump himself will be loyal to Netanyahu, but Netanyahu will have to be loyal to President Trump.
True. And Trump, like you said, he's wiser. Maybe the people of Greenland would beg to differ. But
on the Middle East, I don't know. On the Middle East, regarding Netanyahu, you know what? Not on the Middle East, but at least I hope that he learned from experience with Netanyahu, because he did have 4 years of experience with Netanyahu. He should know by now that what Netanyahu says is not necessarily what you get, right?
Yes, and I think that should be probably the title of this podcast, not Tal Shalev and Neri equal Itamar Ben Gvir. Tal, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on, and let's not wait another year till you come back on to break it all down for us. So
thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, thanks again to Tal Shalev, as always, for her generous time and insights. Also, special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so it can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. Here's hoping for a healthy, happy, and yes, more peaceful new year for all of us. And most importantly, thank you for listening.